Puff Diddy attacks Cassie in court after she leaks new footage. Sean Diddy Combs, who faced serious charges including sex trafficking, racketeering, and prostitution. Central to the prosecution's case is the harrowing testimony of Cassie Ventura, Diddy's ex-girlfriend and former bad boy entertainment artist, who accuses Diddy of a decade-long pattern of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Cassie's testimony reveals a terrifying picture of control, coercion, and violence, including freak-offs drug-fueled. Sexually exploitative parties allegedly orchestrated and recorded by Diddy with women forced to perform acts on hired escorts. The courtroom was a fortress of tension and anticipation, with the glare of camera flashes punctuating the crisp morning air. Reporters clustered outside the courthouse, their microphones bristling with impatience, ready to capture every detail of what had become the most talked-about trial in recent history. Sean Puff Diddy Combs had been in and out of headlines for decades, but never like this. Never with such gravity, such darkness looming over his legacy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The allegations against Diddy were staggering: charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, and prostitution, all stemming from a series of explosive testimonies led by his former protege and ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. The former bad boy entertainment artist had taken the stand with a poise that belied the horrors she described. Her testimony painted a chilling portrait of Diddy as a man wielding power and influence not just to build an empire, but to control, coerce, and abuse. But it was not just her words that shook the courtroom. It was the leaked footage, the raw, unfiltered evidence that showed Diddy violently attacking Cassie in a hotel suite back in 2016. The grainy video, released anonymously online, spread like wildfire, reigniting public outrage and adding a new layer of intensity to an already fraught legal battle. The morning of the court session where that footage would be presented was electric with anticipation. Barricades had been set up around the perimeter of the courthouse, and security was visibly heightened. Armed guards flanked the main entrance, their faces grim with the weight of what was to come. Journalists jostled for position, snapping photos of every arrival. When Cassie finally emerged from a black SUV, shielded by bodyguards, and wearing a simple black coat that trailed down to her ankles, the flashbulbs erupted in a blinding display of light. She moved quickly, head held high, eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the shouted questions and pointed microphones that lunged at her from every angle. Diddy arrived minutes later, escorted by a phalanx of his own security detail. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, he projected an image of confidence, his stride purposeful, his gaze unyielding. But for those who watched closely, there were cracks in the facade. His jaw was clenched tighter than usual, his eyes flickered with something unspoken, anxiety, perhaps, or the awareness that the empire he had built was teetering on the edge of collapse. The crowd outside the courthouse was not kind. Boos and jeers erupted from pockets of protesters, their signs hoisted high with slogans like "Justice for Cassie" and "No More Silence." Diddy's expression did not waver, but his pace quickened as he disappeared into the courthouse, flanked by his attorneys. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Rows upon rows of spectators filled the gallery, a mix of press, legal observers, and supporters for both sides. The tension was palpable, heavy with the weight of expectation and simmering outrage. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman with a steely gaze named Jessica Morales, sat poised at her table, stacks of evidence neatly arranged before her. Diddy's defense team, led by the renowned criminal attorney Michael Brandt, was equally composed, their expressions betraying nothing as they whispered among themselves, their eyes flickering back and forth between Diddy and the judge's empty bench. The gavel struck once, sharp and deliberate, and the room fell into a hush. The judge, a stern-faced man with years of high-profile cases under his belt, took his seat and adjusted his glasses. He looked out over the room, pausing as if to let the gravity of the situation sink in before speaking. "We are here today to review new evidence submitted to this court, evidence that may have substantial implications on the ongoing proceedings," he began, his voice steady and unyielding. "I must remind everyone present that this is a court of law. Respect and order will be maintained at all times." The tension thickened as the prosecutor stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, the evidence we are about to present is of a particularly sensitive nature. We would like to request heightened security measures for the protection of the witness and the integrity of the footage. The judge nodded, gesturing for additional guards to take their places along the gallery's edge. Jessica Morales turned back to the room, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will bear witness to a piece of evidence that speaks louder than any testimony. It is raw, it is unfiltered, and it is the truth captured in real time. She turned toward the gallery where Cassie sat, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed forward. Morales' voice softened. Ms. Ventura has been brave enough to come forward and share her story. But today, it will not just be her words. Today, you will see it for yourselves. The lights dimmed slightly, and a screen was lowered behind the prosecutor's table. A projector hummed to life, its light flickering against the backdrop of the courtroom's polished wooden walls. A hush fell over the room, breath held in collective anticipation. The screen went black for a moment before grainy, handheld footage emerged. The timestamp in the corner read 2016. The setting was unmistakable, a lavish hotel suite with marble countertops and towering glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. At first, the video was silent, the camera shaking slightly as it adjusted its focus. Then voices could be heard, muffled but distinct. Diddy's voice rose above the din, sharp and forceful, laced with a tone of control. Cassie's voice followed, softer, pleading. The room remained silent as the scene unfolded, a confrontation escalating with every passing second. The footage showed Diddy advancing toward her, his gestures aggressive, his body language unmistakably threatening. Cassie backed away, her hands raised defensively. There was no sound in the courtroom, just the crackling tension of what everyone was watching unfold in real time. The silence was shattered by the sound of impact, Diddy's hand connecting with her shoulder, her body stumbling back against the edge of the hotel bar. Gasps erupted from the gallery, murmurs spreading like wildfire before the judge's gavel crashed down. Order, he demanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. The video continued to play, unyielding and unflinching in its depiction of violence. The footage cut off abruptly, the screen flickering back to black before retracting into the ceiling. The room was stunned into silence, the weight of what they had witnessed settling like lead. Jessica Morales turned back to the courtroom, her expression resolute. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what this case is about. Not rumors, not accusations, but evidence. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence of control, of violence, and of the abuse of power. Her words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. Diddy's defense team immediately objected, their voices rising in a cacophony of legal jargon, citing privacy violations and manipulated evidence. Michael Brandt stood, his voice booming across the courtroom. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to sway public opinion. That footage is circumstantial at best, and we intend to prove it. The judge silenced the room with another strike of his gavel, but the damage had been done. The footage was seared into the minds of everyone present, a stark visual that contradicted every denial Diddy's team had offered. Diddy's expression was one of stone, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, but unflinching. He whispered something to his lawyer, who nodded grimly. The battle lines were drawn. The courtroom, once tense with expectation, was now charged with the promise of conflict. Cassie remained seated, her eyes forward, unyielding. For the first time in what seemed like years, the truth was no longer just whispered behind closed doors or speculated in tabloid headlines. It was visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The story of Sean Puff Diddy Combs is one of monumental success shadowed by whispers of controversy and control. To understand the magnitude of the current legal storm surrounding him, it's crucial to trace back to the beginning of his empire, the rise of Bad Boy Entertainment, and the man who built it. Diddy's journey began in the early 1990s, a time when hip-hop was shifting from underground culture to mainstream dominance. Born in Harlem and raised in Mount Vernon, New York, Diddy's entrance into the music industry was marked by an unyielding drive for success. His internship at Uptown Records was his first real taste of the business, where he quickly ascended the ranks due to his sharp instincts and relentless work ethic. By 1993, his ambition outgrew his position at Uptown, and he took a daring leap, launching his own label, Bad Boy Entertainment. It was a gamble that would pay off in historic proportions. Bad Boy Entertainment quickly became synonymous with chart-topping hits and larger-than-life personas. Diddy's knack for discovering raw talent transformed the label into a powerhouse. The world was introduced to the notorious B.I.G., whose debut album Ready to Die became a cultural phenomenon. Hits like Juicy and Big Papa catapulted Biggie to superstardom, while solidifying Bad Boy's reputation as a major player in the hip-hop scene. Diddy's vision extended beyond music. He orchestrated a brand that encapsulated a lifestyle, opulence, power, and influence. But behind the glamorous facade, whispers of coercion, manipulation, and control lingered. Industry insiders spoke in hushed tones about Diddy's iron grip over his artists, his ruthless business practices, and his unyielding demand for loyalty. Contracts were airtight, favoring Bad Boy Entertainment in ways that left many of its artists with little financial gain despite their chart-topping successes. Rumors swirled about underhanded tactics, threats of blackballing those who dared to cross him, whispered promises that transformed into ironclad obligations, and a lifestyle that blurred the lines between excess and exploitation. Among those drawn into Diddy's orbit was Cassie Ventura. The young singer, model, and dancer signed with Bad Boy Entertainment in 2005 after her breakout single Me and You captured the attention of both fans and industry executives. Her relationship with Diddy began as strictly professional, but it quickly evolved into something more personal and far more complicated. Insiders described their dynamic as one of power imbalance, with Diddy maintaining control not only over her career but her personal life as well. Cassie's rise to fame was rapid, but it came at a cost. Those close to her would later reveal the suffocating nature of her relationship with Diddy, one marked by isolation, manipulation, and control. It wasn't just Cassie. As Diddy's empire grew, so too did the whispers of coercion and manipulation. Artists under the Bad Boy label, including notable names like Maze, Faith Evans, and 112, would later speak out about their experiences, contracts that locked them into financial bondage, creative control that was stifled, and the constant fear of being cut off from the music scene entirely if they stepped out of line. For many, Diddy's dominance wasn't just business, it was personal. His power in the industry was unparalleled, and to cross him was to risk exile from the music world entirely. Behind the glossy magazine covers and red carpet appearances, a different narrative was playing out, one of domination and control masked by luxury and excess. Diddy's famed parties, extravagant showcases of wealth and celebrity status, were described by insiders as not just celebrations but stages for influence and power plays. His infamous White Party, held annually in the Hamptons, was a gathering of the industry's elite, musicians, actors, politicians, all mingling under Diddy's watchful eye. For many, these events were more than just parties. They were symbols of Diddy's reach, his ability to pull strings and orchestrate the movements of those around him. It was during these gatherings that the first whispers of darker activities began to surface. The term freak-offs became synonymous with these exclusive parties, drug-fueled, sexually exploitative gatherings where Diddy's influence was absolute. According to multiple testimonies, these events were more than just lavish celebrations, they were arenas of control. Women, many of them aspiring artists or models, were allegedly coerced into compromising situations, their participation encouraged or outright demanded in exchange for favors or opportunities within the industry. Witnesses described an atmosphere of indulgence, where consent blurred and power was wielded without accountability. The public image of Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or simply Diddy, depending on the era, was one of grandeur and success. He was the kingmaker, the mogul who transformed hip-hop into a global phenomenon. But beneath that image lay a foundation built on influence and fear. Industry insiders knew better than to cross him. Bad Boy artists who tried to break free found themselves struggling to maintain their careers. Maze famously fought to regain his publishing rights, calling out Diddy publicly for holding on to contracts that limited his ability to profit from his own music. It was a story that echoed through the halls of Bad Boy's legacy. Artists trapped in binding agreements, unable to reclaim their art, while Diddy prospered. Cassie's entrance into his world marked a new chapter in his legacy. Their relationship, characterized by extravagant gifts and public displays of affection, masked the darker undercurrents of control and coercion that would later surface in court. Former associates would testify that Cassie's movements were tightly monitored, her professional choices scrutinized and managed by Diddy himself. Insiders alleged that she was often isolated from friends and family, her world narrowed to the confines of Diddy's circle. Public appearances were coordinated, her image crafted to fit the narrative of a luxurious life, while behind closed doors, the reality was far more sinister. As Bad Boy's empire expanded, so did Diddy's influence. His ventures into fashion with Sean John, his stake in Ciroc Vodka, and his various business dealings only added to his reach. His wealth ballooned, his status cemented as one of hip-hop's most powerful figures. But power, as the saying goes, corrupts. And for Diddy, power was wielded not just in boardrooms and recording studios but behind closed doors, where cameras did not reach and whispers could be silenced. It is within this context that the accusations against Diddy began to emerge. Cassie's testimony was not just an isolated event. It was a revelation of a pattern of behavior that had been whispered about for years but never fully exposed. Her claims of abuse, control, and coercion were amplified by the backdrop of Bad Boy's legacy of manipulation. For years, Diddy had maintained an image of untouchable power, but now, under the glare of courtroom lights, that image was fracturing. The leaked footage of him attacking Cassie in 2016 was a blow to his reputation, but it was also a crack in the dam that held back years of alleged abuse and corruption. For the first time, Diddy's empire was under siege. Not by rival record labels or industry competition, but by the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. The Bad Boy legacy, built on the foundations of dominance and control, was now exposed to the world, its underbelly laid bare for all to see. And as the trial continued, the question loomed larger than ever. Would Diddy's legacy of power and influence be enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions? Or was the empire he had built about to crumble under the weight of truth? The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, every eye fixed on the witness stand. The air was heavy with anticipation as Cassie Ventura, the woman at the center of the storm, took her place. Her hands were steady as she raised them to take the oath, her gaze unflinching as she looked out over the sea of faces, journalists, legal teams, spectators, all waiting to hear her story. For years, Cassie had been known to the world as the stunning singer who had captured Puff Diddy's eye and risen to fame under the Bad Boy Entertainment umbrella. But today, she was no longer the glamorous muse. She was a survivor stepping into the light. Her attorney, a poised woman named Rebecca Grant, approached the stand with measured steps. The room was silent except for the faint hum of cameras recording every moment. Cassie's expression was resolute, her posture straight, as she prepared to recount years of what she described as torment and control at the hands of Diddy. This was her moment, her chance to finally speak the truth that had been shrouded in secrecy and power for over a decade. "Ms. Ventura," Grant began, her voice clear and steady, "could you please tell the court how you first came to work with Mr. Combs?" Cassie took a deep breath before responding. "I was 19. I had just released my first single, Me and You, and it caught his attention. He reached out through my management, said he saw potential in me. He wanted to make me a star." Her voice was calm, but there was a tension in her words that was impossible to ignore. "And did he?" Grant asked, her tone gentle but probing. Cassie's eyes flickered for a moment before she nodded. "Yes, he did. At first." There was a pause, and Grant leaned forward. "At first," she repeated. Cassie's gaze hardened. Things changed. It stopped being about the music. It stopped being about me. It became about control. The room shifted uneasily. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of her expression. Grant continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Can you explain what you mean by control?" Cassie nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the stand. "He controlled everything, where I went, who I spoke to, even what I wore. At first, I thought it was just part of the business, you know? Like he was looking out for me. But it got worse. He wouldn't let me go anywhere without his permission. My friends stopped coming around because they didn't want to deal with him. He monitored my phone, my emails, everything." Her words hung heavy in the air, the silence punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the soft clicks of cameras. Grant pressed forward, her eyes locked onto Cassie's. "And did this control extend beyond your professional life?" Cassie's eyes dropped to her hands for a moment before she looked up again, resolve written across her face. "Yes, it did." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward. "It wasn't just business. It was personal. He made it impossible for me to have a life outside of him. I wasn't allowed to date. I couldn't go out with friends. And if I ever did something he didn't approve of, there were consequences." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Consequences?" Cassie swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He would get angry. Really angry. Things would get physical sometimes. He would throw things, shout, break stuff. Sometimes it was worse than that." The tension in the room spiked, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Grant moved closer, her voice low and steady. "Did you ever feel unsafe?" Cassie hesitated, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Yes, she whispered. I did. All the time. Grant paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Did you ever try to leave? A flash of something crossed Cassie's face. Anger, pain, regret. I tried, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But every time I tried, he would find me. He would show up wherever I was, or he would call me, or send people to bring me back. He always knew where I was. The room was utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped their scribbling, their pens frozen in midair. Grant stepped back slightly, her eyes never leaving Cassie's. Ms. Ventura, can you explain to the court what you meant when you described freak-offs during your earlier testimony? A murmur rippled through the courtroom at the mention of the term. Cassie's eyes darkened, her jaw setting with determination. They were parties, she began, her voice firm. Not normal parties. He would bring in women, sometimes models, sometimes dancers. There were always drugs, always alcohol. And then, things would happen. Grant pressed further. Can you clarify what you mean by things? Cassie's gaze did not waver. He would orchestrate activities, sexual activities. He would direct things, tell people what to do, who to do it with. And it wasn't always consensual. People were too high or too scared to say no. A collective gasp moved through the gallery. Diddy's defense team shifted uncomfortably, whispering hurriedly among themselves. Grant leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And you witnessed this? Cassie's response was immediate. I did more than witness it. I was part of it. Not because I wanted to be, but because I didn't have a choice. Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. He would pressure me, threaten me. I knew if I didn't comply, there would be consequences. The prosecutor paused for a moment, allowing Cassie's words to hang in the air, heavy and damning. She stepped back, her gaze scanning the room before returning to Cassie. Ms. Ventura, why are you coming forward now? After all these years? Cassie's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. Because I'm tired of being silent. I'm tired of watching him hurt people and get away with it. Someone has to say something. Someone has to do something. Her words resonated through the courtroom, the weight of them settling like a stone. There was no denying the gravity of what had just been shared. Years of whispered rumors and backstage secrets were now laid bare in the cold light of the courtroom, and the entire world was watching. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched on for what felt like eternity. We will take a brief recess, he announced, his voice strained with the tension of the morning's revelations. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The room erupted into noise, reporters rushed for their phones, defense attorneys huddled around Diddy, whose expression remained a mask of indifference. But for Cassie, it was a moment of liberation. She stepped down from the witness stand, her back straight, her head high. For the first time in years, she had spoken her truth, and there was no going back. The courtroom was tense with anticipation as whispers of new evidence began to circulate among the crowded benches. Reporters leaned in closer, their pens poised, and the gallery buzzed with speculation. For weeks, Cassie's testimony had painted a chilling portrait of her years under Diddy's control, but her words were just that, words. Now, the prosecution claimed they had something far more damning, leaked footage, evidence that had surfaced online just days prior, showing Puff Diddy in a moment of uncontested violence against Cassie. It was footage that had spread like wildfire across social media, igniting outrage and sparking a renewed call for justice. Today, it would be played in court for the very first time. The judge entered the room, his face grave and his steps deliberate. His gavel struck sharply against the bench, silencing the whispers instantly. We are here to review new evidence submitted by the prosecution, he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. I must remind all present that this is a court of law. Decorum will be maintained at all times. His eyes swept over the gallery, pausing momentarily on the sea of cameras and notepads before settling on the prosecution. Jessica Morales, the lead prosecutor, stood confidently and approached the bench. Her expression was steely, her steps unhurried as she laid out the details. Your Honor, the evidence we are presenting today is a recording, footage captured from a hotel security camera dated August 12, 2016. This video, which was anonymously uploaded and subsequently verified for authenticity, depicts Mr. Combs in a violent altercation with Ms. Ventura. We believe this footage is critical in supporting the charges of assault and coercive control. She turned to the gallery, her gaze sweeping over the rows of spectators. Today, we bring you the truth, not in whispers, but in vivid, undeniable proof. A murmur rippled through the room. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, his expression stony but betraying a flicker of tension in the set of his jaw. His attorney, Michael Brandt, leaned over to whisper something into his ear, to which Diddy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed forward. The lights dimmed, and the large screen that had been set up behind the prosecution's table flickered to life. A timestamp appeared on the bottom right corner, August 12, 2016. The video was grainy, the quality typical of hotel surveillance, but the figures were unmistakable. Diddy stood near the window of a lavish hotel suite, his posture tense and his hands gesturing wildly. Cassie was visible just a few feet away, her arms crossed defensively, her body angled away from him. There was no audio, but the body language spoke volumes. The room watched in utter silence as the scene unfolded. Diddy moved forward suddenly, his arm reaching out to grab her by the wrist. The motion was swift, aggressive, and unyielding. Cassie tried to pull away, but his grip remained firm. She stumbled back, her hand raised in defense as he advanced again, his gestures sharp and accusatory. The video continued for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the room growing with each passing second. It was when Diddy raised his hand and struck her across the face that the room collectively inhaled, a sharp gasp that echoed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the judge hammered his gavel to restore order. But the footage continued. Cassie staggered back, one hand clutching her cheek, her face twisted in pain. Diddy's expression was cold, his body language unyielding as he pointed toward the door, his lips moving in what appeared to be harsh demands. The footage played on, capturing Cassie's reluctant compliance as she moved toward the door, her head lowered, her steps hurried. When the video finally faded to black, the room remained silent, the weight of what had just been witnessed settling like a shroud over the crowd. Jessica Morales stood still, her gaze fixed on the screen even as it flickered off. The silence stretched on for a beat longer before she finally turned to face the courtroom. "That," she began, her voice steady and unyielding, "is just a glimpse of what Ms. Ventura endured. A single moment captured on film, but one that speaks to a pattern of abuse and control spanning years." The judge cleared his throat, his expression grim. "The footage is now entered into evidence," he declared, his voice breaking the tension that had solidified in the air. "The jury will take it into consideration along with the testimonies already provided." His gavel struck sharply, signaling the end of the presentation. The gallery erupted into murmurs, reporters jostling to type out headlines and photographers snapping shots of the prosecution's somber expressions. But the reaction from the defense was immediate and fierce. Michael Brandt stood abruptly, his voice sharp and defiant. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this evidence on the grounds that it was obtained unlawfully and violates my client's right to privacy. We have yet to verify the chain of custody for this footage, and until that is done, it should not be considered admissible." The judge's gaze shifted from Brandt to Morales. "Counselor, how do you respond to these claims?" Morales straightened, her expression unwavering. "The footage was provided anonymously, yes, but it has been verified for authenticity by independent analysts. Its contents are relevant and directly corroborate the testimonies provided by Ms. Ventura and other witnesses. To exclude it would be to ignore evidence of abuse that is both clear and undeniable." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped thoughtfully. "I will review the arguments over the next recess and provide a ruling at the next session. Until then, the footage remains part of the official record." His gavel struck again, and the room was released from its tension, the whispers and chatter spilling out into the hallway as reporters hurried to broadcast the day's revelations. Outside the courtroom, the reactions were immediate and fierce. News channels ran the footage on repeat, anchoring it with commentary from legal analysts and activists. The video, though grainy, was crystal clear in its depiction of violence, and public opinion began to sway heavily against Diddy. Protests gathered outside the courthouse, their signs emblazoned with slogans like "Justice for Cassie" and "No More Silence." Social media exploded with hashtags, #JusticeForCassie, #SurvivorsSpeak, and #HoldHimAccountable. It was a viral storm of outrage and support, the likes of which had not been seen since the initial accusations emerged. Diddy's camp, however, did not remain silent. His PR team issued statements denouncing the footage as manipulated and misleading. They accused the prosecution of staging a smear campaign and vowed to challenge the admissibility of the evidence in court. "This is not justice. This is a witch hunt," one of his representatives declared during a live interview. "We intend to fight this every step of the way." Despite the denials, the footage was a turning point. It gave the allegations weight and form, no longer just the words of accusers, but visual proof of violence and coercion. The prosecution wasted no time capitalizing on the momentum, bringing forth additional witnesses who testified to seeing similar incidents during private gatherings and freak-offs. One woman, a former employee at a hotel where Diddy frequently hosted parties, described witnessing physical altercations and even threats made to keep staff silent. Her voice shook as she recounted the fear that lingered after those nights: fear of losing her job, fear of retaliation. The judge's ruling on the footage would not be announced until the following week, but the damage to Diddy's public image was already done. His name trended on social media not for music or business ventures, but for violence, manipulation, and control. For Cassie, the release of the footage was both vindication and validation. Her story was no longer just a testimony. It was captured reality, undeniable and unyielding. The courtroom was brimming with tension the morning Diddy returned to face the latest revelations. The leaked footage of his altercation with Cassie had transformed the case overnight, igniting public outrage and shifting the narrative in ways even his powerful legal team had not anticipated. Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters gathered, their signs raised high and voices echoing demands for justice. Chants of justice for Cassie, and no more silence, filled the air, creating a cacophony of resistance against the mogul who had long been untouchable. Security was heightened, police barriers stretched for blocks, and armed officers stood watch as celebrities, legal teams, and press funneled into the courthouse. Reporters jockeyed for position, microphones poised and cameras flashing. Diddy's arrival was as dramatic as expected. His entourage of black SUVs rolled up to the steps, and the doors swung open to reveal the man himself, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, sunglasses reflecting the flashing lights of 1,000 cameras. He walked briskly, head held high, ignoring the shouts and jeers from the crowd. His security formed a human barricade, shielding him from the chaos that swirled around him. Cassie arrived moments later, her demeanor far different from his. Flanked by her legal team, she wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression resolute. There were no sunglasses to hide behind, no towering security to separate her from the crowd. Protesters reached out, some touching her hand as she passed, murmuring words of encouragement. She acknowledged them with a nod, her gaze forward, her purpose clear. This was not just her battle. It had become a fight for justice for all the women whose stories were still locked behind fear and silence. Inside, the courtroom was buzzing with energy. Legal teams shuffled through papers, whispered strategies, and exchanged glances of tension and anticipation. The judge entered, his expression stern and unyielding, and with a sharp rap of his gavel, silence fell. "Order in the court," he declared, his voice carrying a weight that demanded compliance. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the prosecution. "We are here today to resume testimony and address the new evidence presented last session. Is the prosecution ready to proceed?" Jessica Morales, the lead prosecutor, stood with the confidence of someone holding the upper hand. "We are, Your Honor." She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "We would like to call Ms. Ventura back to the stand to continue her testimony, specifically in relation to the events depicted in the footage introduced last week." There was a murmur of approval from the gallery, followed by the soft rustle of reporters adjusting their cameras and notepads. Cassie rose from her seat, her steps measured and calm as she approached the witness stand. The room was silent as she took her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked straight ahead, unflinching as she raised her hand and swore to tell the truth. Morales wasted no time. "Ms. Ventura, you testified previously about the nature of your relationship with Mr. Combs. Can you now explain to the court what happened the night depicted in that footage?" Cassie's gaze was steady. "We were staying at the hotel for a bad boy event. It was supposed to be a celebration, but things turned bad quickly. He had been drinking, a lot. I could tell he was agitated." Morales nodded. "What sparked the altercation?" Cassie took a breath, her fingers clenching slightly on the edge of the stand. "He accused me of being disrespectful. I don't even know what I did. Maybe I talked to someone he didn't approve of. Maybe I laughed too loudly. With him, it was always something." The courtroom listened intently as she described how the argument escalated. How his voice grew louder, his gestures more aggressive. She spoke of the tension in his body language, the way he paced the room, hands clenched into fists. He grabbed my wrist, she continued, her voice steady but taut with emotion. I tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. He was shouting. I couldn't even understand half of what he was saying. It just kept getting louder. Morales nodded encouragingly. And then what happened? Cassie's eyes darkened with the memory. He slapped me. Hard. I fell back against the bar. He didn't stop shouting. He just kept yelling, saying things like, "You think you can embarrass me? You think you can just do what you want?" It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time someone caught it on camera. The room was silent, every eye trained on her. Even Diddy, who had been whispering with his lawyer moments before, was now locked in place, his expression unreadable. Morales stepped closer, her voice lowering. When the footage surfaced, what went through your mind? Cassie straightened her back. Relief, she said simply. Finally, people would see what I went through. Finally, I wouldn't just be another woman making accusations. There was proof. Morales nodded, her gaze fixed on the jury. Thank you, Ms. Ventura. No further questions. The defense rose immediately. Michael Brandt adjusted his cuffs as he approached the stand, his expression measured and confident. He wasted no time. Ms. Ventura, you claim this footage depicts abuse. But isn't it true that you remained in a relationship with Mr. Combs for years after this incident? Cassie's eyes narrowed. I did, she replied evenly. Brandt smiled slightly, as if the answer had been expected. So, if this was truly an abusive relationship, why did you stay? The question hung in the air, a challenge designed to cast doubt. Cassie met his gaze, unyielding. Because I was afraid. He controlled everything, my career, my finances, my life. Leaving wasn't an option. He made sure of that. Brandt raised an eyebrow. Afraid? You were a successful artist, a public figure. Are you telling this court you had nowhere to turn? Cassie's hands tightened on the edge of the stand. You don't understand. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about power. He had control over everything. He knew people. He could make things disappear. People disappear. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery before the judge banged his gavel. Order, he barked, silencing the crowd. Brandt leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. So you're saying you were trapped? Yes, Cassie replied, her voice unwavering. I was. Brandt paused, his eyes scanning the jury before turning back to Cassie. And yet you stayed, until now. He let the words linger, a suggestion of doubt. What changed, Ms. Ventura? Why come forward now? Cassie's eyes glimmered with defiance. Because now I'm not afraid anymore. I'm tired of being silent. I'm tired of watching him get away with it. Brandt seemed ready to counter, his mouth opening to form the next question, but the judge interjected. Counselor, that's enough for now. We'll reconvene after a short recess. His gavel struck, signaling the temporary halt, and the gallery erupted into whispers and hurried conversations. Outside, the protests had doubled in size, the crowd swelling as news of the explosive testimony spread. Reporters scrambled to update their headlines, commentators speculated about the jury's reaction, and legal analysts debated the impact of the footage on the overall case. Inside, Cassie returned to her seat, her head held high, her expression resolute. Across the aisle, Diddy sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the table before him. It was clear that the tide had begun to turn, and the battle for truth and accountability was far from over. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation, as the doors swung open and Daniel Phillip walked through, escorted by two marshals. Tall and lean, with sharp features and a steely gaze, he was the latest witness to take the stand, a male escort whose testimony was expected to shatter whatever remained of Diddy's public facade. Daniel's name had surfaced amid the flood of allegations against the music mogul, his account promising to unveil yet another layer of darkness to an already explosive trial. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised and cameras angled, capturing every movement. The gallery, packed to capacity with press, legal observers, and victims' advocates, seemed to hold its collective breath as Daniel took his seat at the witness stand. He raised his right hand, solemnly swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. His voice was steady, betraying no hesitation. Jessica Morales approached the stand, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her expression resolute. Mr. Phillip, she began, her voice clear and measured, can you please tell the court how you first came to be acquainted with Sean Combs? Daniel glanced out over the sea of faces, pausing briefly before answering. I was hired for one of his parties, he replied evenly. His voice was low but carried easily through the silence of the room. It was one of his private events. They called them freak-offs. The term sent a murmur rippling through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, and several members of the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Morales continued without missing a beat. Can you describe for the court what you mean by freak-offs? Daniel nodded, his expression hardening. They were parties. But not just regular parties. They were, well, orchestrated events. Diddy would invite models, dancers, escorts, both male and female. Drugs, alcohol, everything you can imagine. And there were expectations. Morales leaned in slightly. Expectations? Daniel's gaze did not waver. Sex. It was always about sex. He would pair people up, sometimes force people to engage in things they weren't comfortable with. Sometimes he'd watch. Sometimes he'd film. The gallery erupted in murmurs, punctuated by gasps of disbelief. The judge's gavel crashed down, demanding order. Diddy's legal team huddled together, whispering urgently, their expressions grim. But Daniel remained composed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, eyes forward. Morales pressed on. And did you participate in these events? A flicker of emotion crossed Daniel's face. Shame, perhaps, or regret. Yes, he replied simply. I did. It was part of the deal. You showed up, you did what you were told, and you got paid. Morales's voice softened, but her gaze remained unyielding. Did you ever feel you had a choice? Daniel shook his head, his hands tightening into fists. No, not really. Once you were in, you were in. If you tried to back out, they'd threaten you. Not with violence, not directly, but they'd say things. They'd tell you how easy it was to make someone disappear, how nobody would believe you if you spoke up. They had power, and they weren't afraid to use it. The gallery was silent, every face fixed on Daniel as he spoke. His voice was calm, but edged with a tension that hinted at the weight of his experiences. Morales stepped back slightly, giving him room to breathe before continuing. Mr. Phillip, you mentioned that sometimes Diddy would film these events. Can you elaborate on that? Daniel's jaw clenched. Yeah, he would set up cameras sometimes. Sometimes he'd do it himself with his phone. He'd say it was for protection, for leverage, whatever he wanted to call it. But really, it was just another way to control people. If you tried to leave, he had something on you. If you tried to speak out, he could make sure nobody listened. Morales nodded thoughtfully. And these recordings, did you ever see them again after the parties? Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping momentarily to his hands. I did. Sometimes he would bring them out at other parties, like trophies. He'd show people, his friends, his business partners. It was like proof of his power. Proof that he could do whatever he wanted, and nobody could stop him. A hush settled over the courtroom. The implications of his testimony were staggering. Diddy not only orchestrated these events but cataloged them, kept them as records of his influence. It was more than just a claim of abuse. It was evidence of systemic control. Morales straightened, her voice steady and deliberate. Mr. Phillip, did you ever see Ms. Ventura at these events? Daniel's eyes darkened slightly. I did. A lot of the time. She was always there, but not because she wanted to be. She would try to leave sometimes, but he wouldn't let her. He'd keep her close, make sure she was always within arm's reach. And if she ever stepped out of line, he trailed off, his voice dropping to a whisper. Well, you saw the footage. A murmur of agreement swept through the gallery, and Morales let it settle before continuing. Did you ever see him physically harm Ms. Ventura at these events? Daniel's response was immediate. Yes. More than once. He didn't care who was around. If he was angry, he'd make it known. I saw him shove her, slap her, even drag her out of the room more than once. People would look away, pretend not to see. Nobody wanted to be next. Morales allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of his words settle before she asked her final question. Mr. Phillip, why are you coming forward now? Daniel's gaze was steady. Because I can't sleep at night knowing what happened. I can't just pretend it didn't happen. People suffered. People were hurt. And it's time that somebody did something about it. The room was silent, the tension heavy and unbroken. Morales turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. She returned to her seat, the gallery buzzing with whispers and speculation. Reporters tapped out headlines at lightning speed, their expressions focused and unyielding. Diddy's defense attorney, Michael Brandt, stood, his expression composed but with an edge of urgency. He approached the stand, his gaze fixed on Daniel. Mr. Phillip, you've testified that you were a participant in these events. Are you aware that participating in such activities is, in fact, a crime? Daniel's expression did not change. Yes, I am. Brant raised an eyebrow. So, should we believe that you are confessing to multiple felonies out of the goodness of your heart? Or is it possible you're seeking a plea deal for your cooperation? Daniel leaned forward, his expression hardening. I'm here because it's the right thing to do. If I have to answer for what I did, I will. But that doesn't make what he did right. Brant's eyes narrowed. Isn't it true that you were paid substantial sums of money to attend these parties? Yes. And isn't it true that you willingly participated? Daniel's gaze did not falter. I did what I had to do. But that doesn't change what I saw. It doesn't change what he did. Brant stepped back, turning to the jury with a practiced look of skepticism. No further questions. He returned to his seat, his expression stony but controlled. The judge straightened, his voice carrying authority as he addressed the courtroom. We will take a brief recess before proceeding with the next witness. Court will resume in 20 minutes. His gavel struck once, sharp and deliberate, signaling the temporary break. Outside the courtroom, the reactions were immediate. Headlines blared across screens, detailing Daniel Phillips' testimony and the implications of Diddy's orchestrated parties. Social media exploded with outrage, demands for accountability spreading like wildfire. Protesters outside the courthouse grew louder, their voices merging into a single, unyielding demand for justice. Inside, Diddy remained seated, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him. Whatever confidence he had projected earlier now seemed to flicker, the cracks beginning to show. His empire, built on power and influence, was shaking at its very foundation, and for the first time, it seemed the walls were beginning to close in. The courtroom was tense with anticipation as the prosecution prepared to unveil its next wave of allegations against Sean "Puff Diddy" Combs. Up until this point, the case had primarily revolved around the personal testimonies of Cassie Ventura and Daniel Phillip, who had bravely stepped forward to detail the abuse and coercion they endured under Diddy's watch. But what was about to be revealed went far beyond isolated incidents. It was the exposure of what prosecutors were calling a criminal enterprise, orchestrated and maintained by Diddy's wealth, influence, and connections. The prosecutor, Jessica Morales, approached the center of the courtroom with a series of files clutched in her hands, her expression steely and resolute. The room hushed, every eye fixed on her as she stepped into the spotlight. Your Honor, today the prosecution will present evidence that what we are dealing with here is not merely a case of personal misconduct, but the operation of a criminal enterprise, she announced, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. We will demonstrate how Mr. Combs systematically used his wealth, influence, and network of connections to orchestrate a web of exploitation, coercion, and violence over a span of 2 decades. The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. Ms. Morales, are you suggesting that Mr. Combs' activities extend beyond these individual claims? Morales nodded confidently. Yes, Your Honor. What we have uncovered is a deeply rooted network of corruption, intimidation, and organized exploitation. She stepped back to the prosecution's table and pulled out a thick folder, which she handed to the bailiff. We submit into evidence a collection of financial records, communications, and eyewitness testimonies that outline the structure of this enterprise. The bailiff passed the documents to the judge, who flipped through them silently, his expression growing more severe with each page. The gallery was tense, reporters craning their necks, pens hovering over notepads, ready to document every word. After a moment, the judge looked up. You may proceed. Morales turned back to the gallery, her eyes sweeping over the jury. To understand the scope of this operation, you must first understand the influence Mr. Combs wields, not just in music, but in business, in politics, and in media. For years, his connections have allowed him to operate with near impunity. Police reports that disappeared, witness statements that were withdrawn, settlements that were paid off in secret. This wasn't just bad behavior. This was systematic abuse, covered up by power and money. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a diagram of interconnected names, dates, and locations, a web that spanned coast to coast. At the center was Diddy, his image fixed in a circle, with lines extending outward to hotels, event venues, and even police precincts. Morales pointed to the diagram. What you see here is a network of influence. Over the years, Mr. Combs has allegedly funneled money into security firms, local law enforcement, and private investigators, his very own cleanup crew to ensure that nothing ever touched him. If someone spoke out, they were silenced. If evidence surfaced, it disappeared. There were gasps from the gallery, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Reporters tapped out headlines as fast as their fingers could fly, and even the jury seemed visibly shaken by the enormity of the allegations. Morales continued, undeterred. We have evidence of payments made to hotel staff to erase security footage, witnesses coerced into silence through intimidation and threats, and even law enforcement officials who were persuaded to drop investigations. The judge raised his hand. Ms. Morales, are you suggesting that law enforcement was complicit in these activities? Morales met his gaze directly. Yes, Your Honor. And we intend to prove it. The room fell silent, the weight of the claims settling heavily over the audience. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp and unyielding. His attorney, Michael Brandt, leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Diddy didn't react. He simply stared straight ahead, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Morales continued, her voice growing stronger. We call our first witness for this section, Mr. Robert Harlan. The name echoed through the courtroom, unfamiliar but important. Harlan was a former security contractor for Bad Boy Entertainment, one who had worked closely with Diddy during his prime years. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and eyes that had seen too much, Harlan walked to the witness stand and took the oath, his gaze steady and unflinching. Mr. Harlan, Morales began, you were employed by Bad Boy Entertainment from 2008 to 2017. Is that correct? Harlan nodded. That's right. And during your time there, were you responsible for overseeing security operations for Mr. Combs and his events? Yes, I was. Morales stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him. Can you explain to the court what your duties entailed? Harlan leaned back slightly, his voice gravelly but clear. Mostly event security. Making sure things went smoothly, keeping the crowds under control. But sometimes we were asked to do more. More. Morales pressed. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued. We'd be asked to clean up situations. If things got out of hand at a party, if there were issues with guests or staff, we were the ones who made it disappear. I mean that literally. Footage, witness statements, even physical evidence. If something happened that wasn't supposed to, it was our job to make sure nobody ever heard about it. The gallery rippled with murmurs, reporters scribbling notes furiously. Morales nodded, her expression resolute. And were you ever asked to intimidate witnesses or potential whistleblowers? Harlan's expression darkened. Yes, more times than I can count. If someone talked too much, if they were asking questions or getting too close, we were sent to handle it. Sometimes it was just a conversation, a reminder of what could happen if they didn't keep quiet. Other times, it was more persuasive. Morales stepped back, letting his words settle over the room. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit 14 into evidence. These are financial records that indicate payments made to Mr. Harlan's security firm, as well as to various third-party contractors, coinciding with reported incidents of violence and coercion. The bailiff delivered the documents to the judge, who studied them carefully. The room was silent, tension crackling in the air. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression severe. This evidence is admitted. Morales turned back to Harlan. Mr. Harlan, were you ever paid to delete footage from hotel security cameras? Yes, he replied without hesitation. More than once. And who gave that order? Harlan's gaze did not waver. Diddy did. Directly. The gallery erupted into whispers, and the judge's gavel crashed down with a sharp crack. Order. There will be order in this courtroom, he barked, silencing the crowd. Morales pressed on. One final question, Mr. Harlan. Were you ever asked to use physical force to silence someone who was threatening to expose Mr. Combs? Harlan paused, his jaw tightening. Yes. Twice. The room fell silent. Even Diddy's legal team looked shaken, their whispers hushed, their expressions grim. Morales stepped back, her eyes scanning the jury. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge looked to Michael Brandt, who stood, his face steely but composed. I will cross-examine after the recess, Your Honor. The judge nodded. We will take a short recess and resume shortly. His gavel struck, and the room buzzed with energy and speculation. Reporters scrambled to update their stories, and the crowd outside the courthouse swelled with new supporters demanding justice. Inside, Diddy remained silent, his expression fixed but strained. His empire, once a symbol of unyielding power, was beginning to crack, and the weight of his alleged actions now hung heavily over the room. This was not just a trial, it was a reckoning. Cassie's eyes dropped to her hands for a moment before she looked up again, resolve written across her face. Yes, it did. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward. It wasn't just business. It was personal. He made it impossible for me to have a life outside of him. I wasn't allowed to date. I couldn't go out with friends. And if I ever did something he didn't approve of, there were consequences. Grant's eyes narrowed. Consequences? Cassie swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. He would get angry. Really angry. Things would get physical sometimes. He would throw things, shout, break stuff. Sometimes it was worse than that. The tension in the room spiked, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Grant moved closer, her voice low and steady. Did you ever feel unsafe? Cassie hesitated, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Yes, she whispered. I did. All the time. Grant paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Did you ever try to leave? A flash of something crossed Cassie's face. Anger, pain, regret. I tried, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But every time I tried, he would find me. He would show up wherever I was, or he would call me, or send people to bring me back. He always knew where I was. The room was utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped their scribbling, their pens frozen in midair. Grant stepped back slightly, her eyes never leaving Cassie's. Ms. Ventura, can you explain to the court what you meant when you described freak-offs during your earlier testimony? A murmur rippled through the courtroom at the mention of the term. Cassie's eyes darkened, her jaw setting with determination. They were parties, she began, her voice firm. Not normal parties. He would bring in women, sometimes models, sometimes dancers. There were always drugs, always alcohol. And then, things would happen. Grant pressed further. Can you clarify what you mean by things? Cassie's gaze did not waver. He would orchestrate activities, sexual activities. He would direct things, tell people what to do, who to do it with. And it wasn't always consensual. People were too high or too scared to say no. A collective gasp moved through the gallery. Diddy's defense team shifted uncomfortably, whispering hurriedly among themselves. Grant leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And you witnessed this? Cassie's response was immediate. I did more than witness it. I was part of it. Not because I wanted to be, but because I didn't have a choice. Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. He would pressure me, threaten me. I knew if I didn't comply, there would be consequences. The prosecutor paused for a moment, allowing Cassie's words to hang in the air, heavy and damning. She stepped back, her gaze scanning the room before returning to Cassie. Ms. Ventura, why are you coming forward now? After all these years? Cassie's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. Because I'm tired of being silent. I'm tired of watching him hurt people and get away with it. Someone has to say something. Someone has to do something. Her words resonated through the courtroom, the weight of them settling like a stone. There was no denying the gravity of what had just been shared. Years of whispered rumors and backstage secrets were now laid bare in the cold light of the courtroom, and the entire world was watching. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched on for what felt like eternity. We will take a brief recess, he announced, his voice strained with the tension of the morning's revelations. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The room erupted into noise, reporters rushed for their phones, defense attorneys huddled around Diddy, whose expression remained a mask of indifference. But for Cassie, it was a moment of liberation. She stepped down from the witness stand, her back straight, her head high. For the first time in years, she had spoken her truth, and there was no going back. The courtroom was tense with anticipation as whispers of new evidence began to circulate among the crowded benches. Reporters leaned in closer, their pens poised, and the gallery buzzed with speculation. For weeks, Cassie's testimony had painted a chilling portrait of her years under Diddy's control, but her words were just that, words. Now, the prosecution claimed they had something far more damning, leaked footage, evidence that had surfaced online just days prior, showing Puff Diddy in a moment of uncontested violence against Cassie. It was footage that had spread like wildfire across social media, igniting outrage and sparking a renewed call for justice. Today, it would be played in court for the very first time. The judge entered the room, his face grave and his steps deliberate. His gavel struck sharply against the bench, silencing the whispers instantly. We are here to review new evidence submitted by the prosecution, he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. I must remind all present that this is a court of law. Decorum will be maintained at all times. His eyes swept over the gallery, pausing momentarily on the sea of cameras and notepads before settling on the prosecution. Jessica Morales, the lead prosecutor, stood confidently and approached the bench. Her expression was steely, her steps unhurried as she laid out the details. Your Honor, the evidence we are presenting today is a recording, footage captured from a hotel security camera dated August 12, 2016. This video, which was anonymously uploaded and subsequently verified for authenticity, depicts Mr. Combs in a violent altercation with Ms. Ventura. We believe this footage is critical in supporting the charges of assault and coercive control. She turned to the gallery, her gaze sweeping over the rows of spectators. Today, we bring you the truth, not in whispers, but in vivid, undeniable proof. A murmur rippled through the room. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, his expression stony but betraying a flicker of tension in the set of his jaw. His attorney, Michael Brandt, leaned over to whisper something into his ear, to which Diddy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed forward. The lights dimmed, and the large screen that had been set up behind the prosecution's table flickered to life. A timestamp appeared on the bottom right corner, August 12, 2016. The video was grainy, the quality typical of hotel surveillance, but the figures were unmistakable. Diddy stood near the window of a lavish hotel suite, his posture tense and his hands gesturing wildly. Cassie was visible just a few feet away, her arms crossed defensively, her body angled away from him. There was no audio, but the body language spoke volumes. The room watched in utter silence as the scene unfolded. Diddy moved forward suddenly, his arm reaching out to grab her by the wrist. The motion was swift, aggressive, and unyielding. Cassie tried to pull away, but his grip remained firm. She stumbled back, her hand raised in defense as he advanced again, his gestures sharp and accusatory. The video continued for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the room growing with each passing second. It was when Diddy raised his hand and struck her across the face that the room collectively inhaled,